It's a pleasure to be connected. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'd love to learn more about your company and what you're currently working on.
Sure. So hi. So Dele Atanda. I basically have three operations. One is it's kind of a good context to put it on. Is I run a non-profit NGO called the Internet Foundation, which is basically responsible for calling for digital human rights on one hand, and working on standards and policies to ensure that companies use data in a responsible and sustainable manner. And then the second thing is I have a company called MetaMe that effectively builds tools to give people ways to take ownership and control of their information, their data, and their digital footprint. Our basic sort of principle is to enable people to take their data and turn it into currency that they can use to get products and services that work for them or make money from effectively. And then the third is a media company we have called Metaiye Media, which basically what we're focused on at the moment is using new technologies to create new types of media assets and media formats that can be owned and controlled using blockchain technologies and cryptocurrencies, and then to use it to tell stories about this changing technology landscape, particularly from an African Afrofuturist perspective. So there's a lot we're doing on that front, and then on the MetaMe front, we're doing a lot around COVID monitoring and protection and giving people ways to control and be able to use their data to protect themselves from the virus on one hand, but also protect their privacy.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think those are very important things that you're working on, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about why you're working on the media side of things and why you think that's important. That's an important link or an important thing to focus on as part of the impact that you want to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it like, mythos and logos, right? We do a lot of logos and pathos and ethos related stuff, which is really around ethics and principles and technology and logic and code and algorithms, and all of these things are critical, obviously, for the space. But it's stories that really connect with people. It's stories that really win revolutions. It's stories that really change the world. And so for us, we understood very early that we needed to find a way to tell the stories of data sovereignty, data ownership, the surveillance industrial complex, and really sort of expose the threat as well as the opportunity to people in a way that they could connect with emotionally. And particularly our people, when it comes to people of color and people of African descent. We're very creatively inspired. Not to say that we're not technically brilliant as well and capable or competent, of course, but we have a high indexing on the creative side as well. So being able to use creative tools as a way to drive education and participation and inclusion has always struck us as an important way to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. One of the things that I noticed, I've observed, is that every major shift in society and the way that we look at things and the way that we progress, they usually stem from media, and they usually stem from culture. And the cultural aspect, the cultural shifts that we experience essentially is what develops, even leads into technology. So for example, when you look at sci-fi, which is essentially what you're doing, Afrofuturism, right? There are a lot of concepts that I think the creators of technology draw from, they draw inspiration from, and that ends up becoming our future. So I think it's very, very powerful to focus on media. And I think media is such an important part of the conversation that doesn't often get talked about. And the opposite of that as well is when it's not done right, when it's not done in a way that is equitable, when it's not done in a way that shows the perspective of different types of people, then that also bleeds into everything else, because media is how we, I think it's how we define the limits of our morals. It's how we define the limits of our society. So if that is the beacon or the indicator of how we're going to function in society, then that's a super important thing that I think in order to create a better future, and a future that includes different perspectives, that includes different 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 things that benefit different types of people. I think that absolutely has to be an important part of the conversation.
I agree with you completely. You know, I think the interesting thing about media and fiction in that regards is it's particularly things like science fiction. It's almost like creating the future, because you're absolutely right. It provides the beacon for technologists, and this is even becoming now a formalized process whereby, you know, large multinational corporations invest in science fiction films, or buy rights in science fiction films, or invest in science fiction writers to actually help on their innovation process. And again, I think you're right, because what happens in media and in film and in fiction particularly is that the rules are very softly established. You know, it's not by court or by consensus, but just by creative license. You know, who is the villain? What is a villain? You know, what kind of behavior is villainous? What kind of behavior is heroic? What is acceptable? I mean, look at Gordon Gekko and Wall Street and that whole greed is good mantra. It wreaked havoc. And you could even say, I mean, without getting too political, but the likes of Donald Trump are a complete manifestation of that culture, of that idea that was really dissipated into society and assimilated in society from that film, Wall Street. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes when you hear people talk about why they respect him or why they continue to vote for him, is they look at they look at the what he represents in terms of success, and they say that is the definition of being American. And so I will go with that. And that idea came from media. That idea came from the things that we consume. And one thing I always say is we even have to be careful with the music that we listen to, because it has such an important effect and such a major effect on who we become, how we see the world, what we end up doing with our lives, and what we deem as worthy of doing with our lives, and what the things that we pursue. So all of that to say, I think it's such a great, brilliant link to add, to supplement the work that you're already doing.
thank you, Rose. And so maybe just so that our viewers can understand a little bit about your background as well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do day to day and what brings you to tech, and then let's get into this industrial revolution subject.
Right, absolutely. So honestly, my main focus is people. I've always been very interested in psychology and how we move forward in terms of our consciousness, and how we evolve as human beings and as a society. That's the basis of it. And so what I'm doing now is business strategy and digital growth and all of that. So I advise companies, small businesses, and I usually do tons of workshops for tech entrepreneurs on how to effectively manage and grow their startups. And I find that very important to do because, again, the people who are at the forefront, who have these great ideas, I want to make sure that I'm contributing the skill sets that I have to helping them be successful, and helping them be competitive with the bigger corporations that maybe have a lot more, a much bigger budget. But
Right.
essentially how that came about, my journey wasn't a linear journey. So I studied psychology and biology, and then I went on to do behavioral neuroscience research. So
Wow.
I'm super interested in, again, our evolution as human beings, right? And how culture shifts and how it moves. And I kind of just accidentally got into tech. So I was in the healthcare space for a very long time. And I started noticing that one of the biggest issues in the healthcare space was just how inefficient it was.
Mm.
And so that inefficiency is one of my pet peeves. And so
Right.
I started exploring ways of how do we optimize the system? How do we make it work for more people? And I also noticed the inequity that existed even within that system from people of color, the access that we have to care, and all of that. But so the reason the way that I made that segue was through entrepreneurship. I've always been interested in entrepreneurship, and so I actually started a business. It was a consulting business, and I got into business development and design and web design and strategy completely by accident because I was working with a freelancer at the time who was developing my previous business. And I
Right.
thought, this is not it. This is not the quality that I want. Let me just learn how to do it myself. And I kind of fell in love with it. And I've been doing it ever since. So and I find that technology is such an important, vital thing to how we're going to develop as a society. It's going to be at the forefront of what human beings will eventually become. And that is just fascinating to me. So, as much as I can be part of the conversation and not only just providing tools to entrepreneurs who are creating change to help them be more successful, but also to be part of that conversation of just us asking ourselves, where are we going? Where do we want to go? And what questions should we be asking ourselves to make sure that the same patterns that we've been following for the last, who knows how long, like hundreds of years, that we're not developing now this other type of eventually this other type of consciousness that is a lot more powerful, but this other type of consciousness that is a lot more powerful but also has our same flaws. So
Mm.
if we build the technology to have our same flaws,
Mm.
but the technology is a lot more powerful than us, then I think that can be catastrophic. And so that's why I think technology is such an important thing to focus on now. And it's exciting for not only for the innovation that is happening, but it's also important for our future as a society, as humans, I think.
Humans, wow. I mean, there's a lot, so many things to talk about there. But let's kind of ground it. Let's get into this fourth industrial revolution and get back into. I feel like this conversation is going to start from robots and machines and take us to, the furthest reaches of humanity and the evolution of humanity in many ways. So yeah, so for IR, what does that mean to you, and what's your take on this fourth industrial revolution?
Hmm. Um, well, I think we're talking about this a little bit before, but it's essentially so with the third industrial revolution, it's like that's the current way that our society is functioning, right? It's manufacturing, it's industry, and even the school system is tailored towards that end goal, which is getting a job, a 9 to 5, and this is you're part of this large corporation that is moving society forward. I think the main thing that is happening and that is different in the fourth industrial revolution is one, data and democratization of so many things that are not currently democratized. So I think that those are the central pieces of it. And I think that is just the next logical step in our evolution as a race. And one of the things that I'm the most excited about the possibility of just things changing in the fourth industrial revolution is that I think people will be more empowered to ask themselves deeper questions and to better align with what they specifically want to do. And they'll have a lot more freedom rather than saying, okay, this is the path that I've chosen, or this is the path that was laid out for me, so I'm going to follow that, which is, I think, the way that a lot of people currently function. When you look at some people in the older generation, that's their mindset and that's how they see the world. So I think it's very exciting to have options, and for us to think more globally, for us to ask ourselves those other questions. And so democratization, I think, is one of the hallmarks for the fourth industrial revolution. Everything is going to be democratized, I think. Hopefully that's the hope that I have. Democratized, and just the or forms of currency now is becoming data, and so data instead, so it's moving away from industry and manufacturing to data. That's that's how I understand the industrial revolution. And what would be your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so I wrote a post like I think it was last year that at Davos the theme was the fourth industrial revolution. So everyone was kind of like got their Davos step on for IR, and so I mean I look at it. I look at the fourth industrial revolution from a slightly different, from a jaded perspective. You know, actually, interestingly enough, I was just thinking about this yesterday. I got into tech from manufacturing cars. So I set up my first business was really a small volume car manufacturing company, where I started basically assembling replicas of classic Porsches, and then I started making them, and eventually we made the highest quality classic Porsches in the world. I was just lucky to be in England at the time, and it was one of the few places where you had the hand skills to be able to shape aluminium and make aluminium cars, which was really disruptive and was very premium in the car in the industry. So I kind of come from this industrial background in that regards. But I do think that when I think about industrialization generally, yeah, I can see industrialization's brought a lot of progress and pace to the world in many regards, but it's also caused a lot of damage. And so I always look at industrialization from that perspective. And I think also, you know, well, from a person of color perspective as well, we have to look at the history of industrialization and understand that this was born on colonialism and slavery. You know, this is the social, political, economic foundation that enabled industrialization to happen in the first place. And in many ways, you know, slave labor was really what the transition to industrialization was, because, you know, human resources in terms of slaves were, or enslaved people were seen as the core, the primary asset class that could lead to wealth creation. And industrialization became a way of automating that physical labor into mechanical labor, effectively. So in that sense, you know, that already kind of starts from a very tainted point of view, but then even ecologically as well, you know, the world we've seen in this COVID pandemic, when the world stopped for 3 months, the planet got healthier, you know, the environment got healthier, the wildlife kind of came back. So I think we have to bear those contexts in mind. But then I think, but you know, that all aside, I think there is an evolution here, and I agree, it's data, it's knowledge, it's information. And you know, the post that I wrote about this was that forget the fourth industrial revolution, it's the fourth human revolution that counts. And my theory around this is essentially that, you know, we have these three big epochs in human evolution. We have the cognitive revolution, where we became conscious primates effectively. And then we had the agricultural revolution, where we became sedentary. And we kind of, what was really material here was our relationship with time. And then we had the industrial revolution, where we became mechanized. And now the fourth revolution is the digital revolution, which is really accelerating the knowledge revolution. But I think that this digital revolution, particularly because of the convergence of the digital revolution with the knowledge revolution and the bioinformation revolution in that regards, is as important as the cognitive revolution. I think we're at this step now where there's going to be a quantum leap as a result of this digitization of information, knowledge, and the evolutionary step that that represents. So on one hand, yes, I believe, yes, jobs are going to be automated and the robots are going to take over production and industrialization will continue. But I do think there's an important point that you made there around democratization. And I think the big difference, what may bring an end to industrialization is the principle of decentralization, which is much more aligned with democratization.
Mm.
And I say that because industrialization really has been about centralization of resources in many ways. And with globalization, that kind of became distributed. We got these distributed supply chains, but concentrated in many regards. And now we're going back to a high degree of localization. But with you look at technologies like 3D printing, for example, and I don't need a car factory if I can print a car in my garage.
Right.
So, really what we're talking about, really the interesting next wave, and I think the things for us as people of color to really be ahead of is the knowledge and information economy, because that is really, it's the distribution of knowledge and data that is really going to drive the economy going forward. The industrial, mechanical, robotic production of or management of the economy, I think is going to, it will be important, maybe for the next 20 to 50 years. But beyond that, I think we're going to actually move away from industrialization, period.
And I mean, you're spot on. I think that's an exciting future to me, that possibility. And so that's why I think conversations like this are important, is for us to start considering that. So one thing I want to ask you is, what in your mind, what do you envision is the antithesis to industrialization? What would you like to happen if you were to envision the future in 75 years? What would that look like, in your opinion?
So it's a good question, and to even take it a step further, I see industrialization and capitalism kind of go hand in hand. And in many ways, communism, socialism, and even the extremes of it, communism, really came out as a response to capitalism and industrialization. And, capitalism's won, communism's failed. I think that's accepted around the world. But is capitalism actually healthy? And certainly unfettered capitalism is exposing itself to be unhealthy. So unfettered industrialization and capitalism in that regards is unhealthy. And I've been thinking around, well, what is the alternative? For me, when I think about it, I really think it's humanism. That's what it really comes down to. I think that's the alternative. I think a human-centric economy, we call this in our lexicon the economy of self, where, as opposed to the surveillance industrial complex, or as opposed to the industrial paradigm that is controlled by a handful at the expense of the many.
The many, right.
So, I mean, let's unpack this a little bit. I think there is obviously going to be an increased automation. So there are going to be more robots that are going to have the jobs and that are going to have productivity in the short term. So when we look at that economically, that means those who own and control the robots are going to be the ones who prosper most in society, unless we have some means of redistributing wealth in a more equitable manner. Mm-hmm. So at the production level, you have that problem. Then you have let's look at the whole intelligence space, right? And I think when you look at, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, and this space, I think when you look at intelligence from a kind of human perspective, and when you look at, I think there are three very different things. So on one hand, you've got intelligence, on one hand, you have consciousness, and on the other hand, you have sentience, right? Now, so far, we've been able to, it's debatable as to whether machines actually really have any intelligence. but they certainly are able to process information
Yeah.
at high speed. I don't think there's any evidence of machines actually being able to know anything or to have any form of knowledge, but certainly, but it's feasible that they could potentially in the future. And it's certainly imminent that they're able to process information more efficiently, more broadly, and more efficiently in a narrow context than humans, right? Now, once you kind of remove that narrow constraint, it becomes very difficult for machines to compete with humans. But in a narrow context, if I ask a machine to read books, it can read books much more quickly than any human ever can, right? But if I can ask it to extract meaning from 5 books, well, it can show patterns, but that's not necessarily meaning,
Same thing,
right?
right. Mm-hmm.
So on that hand, I think humans kind of still lead in terms of knowledge and meaning in the intelligence realm. But in the consciousness realm, well, there's just no evidence of machines ever being conscious.
Right.
And in the sentience space, which again is very different, right? Because that's really about the ability to feel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as an example, dogs are sentient, right? They can feel, they can have emotions, but they're not intelligent. And most would argue that they're not conscious. Not really clear, but not proven. So I think, again, when we look at this what's after industrialization, what does it look like? Because I think what's inevitably going to happen with industrialization is that intelligence is going to be industrialized, and that machine learning is going to be industrialized. AI is going to be industrialized. So, that's really where the battleground is. It's who can accrue knowledge and who can exploit knowledge and leverage knowledge most effectively kind of will get the biggest economic gains. So the industrialization of the knowledge economy is the next thing that's happening there. And I think it's the role that humans play within that is the critical question.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's a brilliant way to put it. And as you explained it, it sounds exactly like the core of the paradigm that is not leading us anywhere is capitalism. It's even the way that we look at it. We look at it, right? Because as we move forward with industrializing intelligence and knowledge, the purpose that we're doing that is for wealth. And but the thinking is that what we value in society will still be wealth, will still be affluence.
Exactly.
So how do we change that? And even starting now, what can we put in place? What can we implement to start asking ourselves, me as an individual, what can I do to be part of changing that paradigm?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And for me, this really ultimately comes back down to this issue of data sovereignty, right? When we look at, if and you're right, when I look at capitalism, and don't get me wrong, I'm not against people making a profit, but the thing is, commerce has preceded capitalism. We had commerce in the world for thousands of years, right? It's not a new thing to have commerce. It's not a new thing to have rich people and for some people to be poor. But capitalism is a bit different than just commerce. So I do think that there is a way to have ethical commerce and to have equitable commerce where, it's meritocratic and those who work hard can make progress. I think there has to be a limit to how far one group of people can be separated from the rest of humanity based on their wealth alone, and we need to police that effectively. But yeah, no, I think capitalism. When I look at capitalism, and as I say, you look back at the history of it through slavery and colonialism, well, you kind of find that we are the capital in capitalism.
Yeah, yeah, that's a brilliant way to put it. Yeah, pretty much.
It's what it really kind of comes to. So when we then look at this surveillance industrial complex that is the new threat, then what we first have to, we have the kind of, what does slavery look like in a post-industrial world, right? That's the question we kind of need to ask. And that's, what does slavery look like in a world of advanced supercomputers, potentially even semi-conscious machines? I mean, that's really far-fetched, but just super intelligent machines. That's very feasible. That's almost here now, right? So in that world, and we've seen, like, through social media already, like through to 2016, and how people can be manipulated and coerced and deceived, and how they can be made to feel a certain way, and how they can be made to behave in a particular way. So how our freedoms can be eroded and taken away. So on one hand, I think, I see, when I look at this data sovereignty, I see three primary pillars. There's the privacy issue, which is kind of just about human dignity, to be honest with you. People who say that privacy is not important or privacy is dead, it's like, okay, then you should just walk down the street naked. I mean, why go into a private place to have a shower, for example?
Right, right.
It's just human decency. It's basic thing in that regard. But of course, it also, then there's the other area, which is around property. And, in that sense, this is kind of more in that territory of capitalism and slavery. In that sense, our information is our property. Our thoughts, our experiences, our knowledge, our memories, our desires, our fears. These are all our information, right? And while on one hand, in the wrong hand can lead to privacy risks and manipulation, but also it's economic risk, because
Right.
this is actually our property, right? So having sovereignty and control over this is really critical. And then you take both this privacy and property things together, and then you really see what they're really enforcing is your ability to be free. And that's really the core essence of it. So if we don't have control over our information from a privacy and a property perspective, then we have no freedom, and we become enslaved again in a much more pervasive and complete way.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. And I'm going to say something a little provocative, but I think what's been happening over time is that slavery never ended. It just kept taking another form and another form and another form and another form. And when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So you have like shelter as like the basic need, shelter, food, the basics, and then all the way up to self-realization. And I think we run the risk of keeping the same pattern where we eventually will get to a place where maybe hunger, extreme famine won't be a thing anymore, but there will be a new baseline.
Yes.
And this other thing that would be unreachable to certain people.
Yes.
And I think that's certain thing that we have to take control of right now, and we have to make a very conscious decision to get right now for ourselves, is exactly what you said, freedom, right? It's what you said, freedom. And I think if we leave it up to the people who have a lot to gain from us not having our freedoms and of us being manipulated, it's never going to happen. So I always want to bring it down to the individual right now, because when you think about the magnitude of the issue, or the potential for disaster that could happen from it, I always want to bring it back to the individual, the parts that we have control of, so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming, so that it doesn't feel hopeless, and that you have absolutely no power in the situation. So
I agree.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So personally, being in the depths of it, right? Working with data, making sure that people have privacy of their data. How do you control your own data? How do you control your own data, and how are you working towards keeping your personal freedom and making sure that your ability to be manipulated is minimized?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and I'm building tools. So my answer is twofold. in that regards. On one hand, so I stay vigilant. I do a lot in terms of policy and advocacy work around shaping law and creating standards, because I think we need to be in the discussion, and the laws are changing rapidly, and the laws enable dystopian futures to come about. So we have to kind of tackle this at the law. I believe there's a hierarchy, which is like ethics, law, commerce, technology. So you start with what is right, what is wrong. Then you enforce that with what is allowable, what's legal and allowable. You then underpin that with what incentivizes people to do what is right and what is legal, and then you build technology to enforce all of that effectively. So, and I operate across those dimensions, those 4 dimensions effectively, in terms of I'm very excited about, I think the new technologies, blockchain, crypto particularly, are really unique because they allow us to establish a new distribution mechanic for this stack. They allow us to create not just a technical stack, but this social stack that we can embody ethics, law, commerce, and technology all into one comprehensive stack that is decentralized. So it can't be corrupted and controlled by centralized authorities. And we, the people, can effectively design this in a way that represents our interests. So on a macro scale, I work heavily in playing a significant role in shaping that stack at all 4 of those levels, and build technical tools that we can put into the hands of everyday people, to be able to take sovereignty and control of their information. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing that is really important to where we started this conversation is giving people the stories that can actually help them understand why this is important, not only why it's important, but also how to win in this battle, in this new landscape and terrain. And, and then translate those stories into experiences that make sense. So we've been developing this comic series and Meta Nights that's very much in this space, is really completely talking about this. And we've done a lot to make it inclusive. So we crowdsourced the platform, the whole technology, the whole company. So people can own a stake in it. We've been running a campaign on Start Engine for the last 9 months or so now. It's raised over 300K. And, a lot of our community, which I'm really excited about, 84% of our investors come from within the people of color community, African American community of people of color, or people of Black and brown people, effectively, which we're really proud of. Yes, I watch my cookies, and yes, I kind of pay attention to some of my privacy policies, but I don't think that, I don't think that's the right answer. I don't think the right thing to say is that, a lot of people say people are really dumb because they place this stuff on Facebook and Twitter, and, it's stupid, why don't you know what's going on? But, I think, back to, it's a really interesting point you make about Maslow's hierarchy. I've looked at that for a while, and it dawned on me a few years ago that it's not actually a pyramid, a hierarchy of needs. It's more like a set of concentric circles. So it's true, self-actualization it's not at the top, it's more like it's at the core. And if we don't reach that core, we're never complete, right? But we all have that need. And this is the thing, as humans, we have a need to self-actualize. We're social creatures. We have a need, and we can only really self-actualize through social interaction. So, this is what makes us human. So we can't deny our humanity. We need to embrace our humanity and use our humanity to excel. So in many senses, I think the onus is really on the tech industry, to us Black techies particularly, to get into the technology and make the technology work for the people. You know, technology, I believe, fundamentally is our friend. The problem is that the people who control the technology currently do not have our interests at heart.
Yeah, and they still hold a lot of biases that they're baking right into the things that they're developing.
Totally.
And yeah, I'm glad you brought up the issue of governance and policy, because I think that's one of the missing pieces right now. So when you look at even right now, it feels like technology is still the Wild West, right? So things are just happening. There are no there are guardrails anywhere. And I think that technology literacy has to be a thing for the policymakers, for the public, for basically everyone. And I don't know if you remember when Mark Zuckerberg had to testify in front of Congress and all of that. And
Do I
the
remember?
questions
Yes.
and the questions they were asking, it showed that there was very little literacy in technology. And so the people making decisions about where technology should go and what those guardrails should be should have technology literacy. So same thing. I mean, when I don't believe that people who are not women should be making laws that control women. Same thing. So I feel like at the very bare minimum, you have to understand what it is that you're creating the law or the policy and what it actually means, how it functions. And so for the common people, the everyday people as well who are not techies, I think it's a huge opportunity for Black techies and for techies of color to reach out to the people around them, like even something as simple as your family, just letting them know how technology functions and the things that you're aware of, the trends that you see coming, just alerting them like, hey, there's actually this thing that's being developed. This is how it might affect society. So let's have a conversation about it. Your group of friends. And even if you are interested in developing some sort of course or program that is technology literacy for non-techies, I think that will have a huge impact. And it kind of ties directly to what we've been talking about, the common theme of how important media is and how important conversations are in lifting that veil, right? Lifting that veil, making sure that we all have our eyes open and that we're all kind of like iterating and ideating together of what the possible future might look like and then working together to get there.
You're so spot on. It's 100% right. And I think, it's like I spend a lot of time, do a lot of work trying to find different ways to come at this idea of data information as currency. We've said it for decades, knowledge is power. It is power and it is currency. But it's one of these wonderful currencies. It's like this. It's like they say, a smile. A smile can deliver so much joy to other people, and it doesn't cost you anything. It's free to give, right? And knowledge can often be that kind of currency. And I think that you're right. We need to, as Black techies, and that comes in many different degrees, right? You could be, I mean, look, I got a 7-year-old son, and he teaches me a lot of things still about how to figure, about gaming and how to find his way around that iPad and iPhone, right? So I think this is the thing, knowledge is abundant, but it is something that when we need to give more. You're absolutely right. We need to see the act of giving. It's not only an altruistic and philanthropic thing, but we do it for ourselves as well, because it makes us all stronger and more informed as a community and better able to protect ourselves as a community. And if our community is stronger, then I'm stronger, and I think it's this kind of mindset around information sharing and information dissemination that is going to be really critical. And I just want to echo the point that you said again about, being part of those policy making decisions as women and as people of color. And, you get these stupid arguments about, what do they call it? Positive discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
Quite frankly, and that people should only be in the room if they've earned the right to be there. I mean, obviously that's a stupid argument for all the reasons on access. But even if you put all of that aside for a moment, the point is that people have massive, not only do they have biases, they have huge blind sides. I cannot sit in a room and represent women's interests the way that a woman can. It's just not possible.
Right, right.
It doesn't matter how empathetic I am, I can't understand what a woman thinks or sees or feels when she sees an image of a robot, of a sex robot, for example, or of a soldier robot. It has a different impact
Mm-hmm.
and interpretation. And if I don't have women beside me when I'm looking at those kind of issues, then I'm going to have blind spots. Not only am I going to have biases, but I'm going to miss things. And that means my solutions are going to be inferior to those who are more inclusive, to those where women are present, to those where people of color are present, because that's going to develop more robust solutions, more effective solutions. And I think on one hand, yes, there are a group of people in society, we have to be honest about this. There are a group of people in society who want to keep the majority down
Mm-hmm.
on and elevate themselves up, whether it's based on the complexion of their skin or whether it's based on the group, the network group, class, if you will, that they were born into. The privileges that they have. Yeah, there are some people who want to keep the system like that, but I think the vast majority of people don't. But
Absolutely.
that even though they don't, they are still biased and they still have blind sides. And unless we address those biases and blind sides, we're never going to make progress.
I completely agree. And to add on to that, I think that also waiting for a system that doesn't even know that there's a problem, waiting for that system to change, I think is not the most productive thing that we could be doing. I think what, in my opinion, what we could be doing that is productive is taking charge of our own narratives and taking charge of the things that we choose to focus on. So, for example, let's say you work for a big corporation and it just feels like you're banging your head against the wall, just trying to make sure that your voice and the voice of your community is heard, and nothing's happening. Well, why don't you explore other possibilities to either, if you want to start your own business, that would be wonderful, where you have full control of what you're creating and who it serves, or you could go to a company where you think that you might be able to make an impact, or even beyond that, look to see who either looks like you or has the same kind of drives and motivations as you, and see how you can partner with them. So one example that I can think of is there is this huge movement on the continent, in West Africa, particularly in places like Ghana and places like Nigeria, and even now in the Caribbean. I'm originally from Haiti. And Haiti now has a budding tech ecosystem. And there is so much possibility. There is so much potential. There are so many opportunities that I think if Black techies were aware of, even Black, doesn't matter where you are around the world, right? And there's something happening in those places. There are so many things that are moving and budding and flourishing in those places that you could contribute to. And you are directly working with people who have your best interest. You are directly working with people who align with your vision of how the future should be, which it should include you. It should have your fingerprints all over it as well, not just the exclusive group in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100. And when I talk about humanism, I always spell humanism with an E, HUE, minism. Because I think ultimately, humanity. I mean, it's a whole nother conversation, but we are one race, and we know this now, scientifically, and we know that the human race is one race. There's more similarity between, people of African descent, dark black skinned people of African descent, and pale skinned, Swedes, then there is, there's more difference between Ghanaians or between Yorubas and Ashantis, or between Yorubas and Zulus, or the Maori, or the Mau Mau, for example. There's a lot more diversity within the continent than there is between the so-called races. So we know we are one race as humanity, and this cult of making one complexion and one tribe elevated across another is foolishness. We know that it doesn't actually, scientifically, we know that this is fallacious. So in that sense, I think the important point about what you say about these communities in Africa and Haiti and the Caribbean, I mean, Haitians, I think, have a really particular contribution and mindset that comes to this innovation space. It's really, I've got a few friends who are really talented technologists who come from that culture. But I think the thing is, when we look at this human revolution in that regards, not only is it important for people of color or people of black and brown people to contribute to this in order to have technology that represents our interests, but I think the world needs it. And the reality is that the tech industry cannot move forward in a way that can address humanity's problems without our participation. You know, you know, all civilization, all humanity comes out of Africa, you know, in that regards. And you cannot separate that strand of the human condition in terms of solving the pure problems of humanity, you know. So it's not only is this necessary for ourselves, but it's really needed for the world in order for the world to be able to step forward and thrive.
Yeah, and also given the fact that we are not the global minority, we're not.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
yeah.
So it's really about and it's this whole thing about diversity again, right? The solutions that address the diverse needs of the global majority. You know, these are the solutions that are going to win. And it's, you know, the world is in a serious state right now. This COVID pandemic is like, it's a real sort of knock knock. Hello, McFly. Time to wake up. And we've got serious global problems that we need to solve on a species level. That's one thing about this COVID pandemic. It is a species level threat. And we need macro species level solutions to these problems. And the solutions that come from this perspective of the global majority, and this is what I mean when I talk about humanism, is really this representation of all of those who want to be part of this fraternity and family of humanity, as opposed to those who want to kind of create these, you know, these splinter cells of exclusion, of exclusiveness and separation and isolation based on some fictitious story of supremacy or privilege or being chosen. All of this is nonsense. There's one humanity. We are one race. And until we start to, until our technologies start to operate from that basis, you know, they are going to be flawed and dangerous to us as a society as a whole.
Yeah, brilliantly said. And I think the silver lining to everything that we're going through with the pandemic is that it revealed that exact fact that we are all in this together. We're all in this together, and it's not going to work. It's no longer going to work if we're working in silos. It's just not. It's not going to work.
Exactly, 100%. No, totally. And you know, we have a really exciting project that we're working on COVID, which is really around how do we get data about COVID out? How do we encourage us all as a global community to create a global data commons around COVID, with data that is private on one hand, that doesn't allow us to, you know, be surveilled and tracked. And I have to say, you know, with the recent threats that protesters for Black Lives Matters could be charged with sedition, which is just beyond, like, you know, it's so perplexing. So there's a real threat around surveillance with COVID. But, you know, by the same token, we've created a means where we can enable people to share data that allows us to fight this pandemic, because, you know, we need the data. to get
Right.
the vaccines, to get the treatments, to get the preventative measures in place to really understand the spread. We need the data, but we can't have that data expose us to an even bigger threat of tyranny and of exploitation, and this future threat of a more pervasive and permanent and persistent enslavement. So, we're
Yeah.
very keen on.
Yeah. And I think we're almost out of time, but that's a great way to bring it back home and to go back to what you were saying about um, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You don't see it as a pyramid; you see it as concentric circles. And I think my call to action would be that I think you're exactly right that self-actualization is at the core of it. And my call to action is that we take this opportunity to ask ourselves, what is our part in it? Right? And we each should be asking ourselves, what am I here to do? What am I here to contribute to this conversation? And it's our responsibility to figure that out, not just for ourselves, but for all of us, but for the progression of humanity. So if you know how to, if you have a huge interest in data, which is exactly what you're doing, you started a startup and now you're doing the work to move that forward. If you have an interest in business, work with entrepreneurs that are developing solutions that you want to see. If you have an interest in, I don't know, media and conversations, make sure that you are allowing more perspectives at the table. Make sure that you are exploring what is it that you're here to bring to the conversation. I think that's one of the most important things that each individual person can do at this point is to figure that out for themselves and then go about the process of actually contributing it.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it any better. I think you're spot on. It's up to us, really. Fundamentally, it's in our hands. So I agree. Everybody needs to find their own role and stand up and be counted and make our contributions accordingly.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have any last words before we
Just
take off?
what an incredible pleasure this has been. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you. Let's more of the same. That's
Yes.
it's,
Yes. Yes. I wish I could talk to you for like 3 hours because I think
we'll
there's so
set that
much
up
more
sometime.
to the conversation. So this was truly a pleasure, and it's been really lovely and inspiring to hear about what you're doing, your perspective, and the work, and how you're pushing it forward. So very, very happy and grateful to have had this opportunity to chat
Thank,
with you.
thank you, Rose. It's really been a pleasure, and I look forward to doing it again soon.
Absolutely. Sounds good.
All right, bye bye.
Bye.